Welcome to today's session titled The Science Behind COVID-19 Vaccines, Establishing Clinical Foundations and Addressing Common Misconceptions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. When you joined today's webinar, you selected either by phone call or computer audio. If for some reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in your control panel. You will also have the opportunity to submit text questions to our presenters today by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions in at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Lindsay Goldman, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging and moderator for today's webinar. Lindsay?
Welcome and thank you for joining us today. As Lucy said, my name is Lindsay Goldman and I am honored to be the new CEO of Grantmakers in Aging. Grantmakers in Aging is a national membership organization of philanthropies that acts as a relevant and responsive network, resource, and champion, amplifying the voices of older people and issues of aging. Today's webinar is the second in our new series on older people and COVID-19 vaccination, and is presented in partnership with the American Federation for Aging Research. The American Federation for Aging Research, known as AFAR, is a national nonprofit organization that supports and advances pioneering biomedical research that is revolutionizing how we live healthier and longer. For nearly 4 decades, AFAR has served as the field's talent incubator, providing more than $101 million to more than 4,200 investigators at premier research institutions nationwide. We'd like to thank our other partner on this series, Generations United, and the John A. Hartford Foundation for supporting today's webinar. With the approval and rollout of COVID-19 vaccines across the United States, hope is on the horizon for protecting millions of older people from the coronavirus. Older adults were carefully included in the clinical trials to develop the vaccines in order to consider the range of health concerns that impact older immune systems. Older bodies accept vaccines in unique ways that require special attention, and understanding the science behind COVID-19 vaccines can help older adults and those who love and serve them to separate fact from fiction and ultimately to improve vaccine uptake. Joining us today to explain more on the scientific considerations around the vaccines is an esteemed panel. Dr. Laura Haynes is an immunologist and gerontologist. She is a professor in the Department of Immunology and the Center on Aging at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. Dr. Kenneth Schmader is professor of medicine and co-director of the Pepper Older Americans Independence Center at Duke University School of Medicine. Dr. Schmader is also the director of geriatric research, education, and clinical center at the Durham VA Healthcare System. He also serves on the U.S. Centers for Disease Control Advisory Committee on immunization practices, including working groups for COVID-19, herpes zoster, influenza, and adult immunization guidelines. And Dr. Nir Barzilai is the scientific director for AFAR, professor of medicine and genetics, director at the Einstein Institute on Aging Research, and principal investigator of the Nathan Schock Center at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Thank you so much for being with us. As mentioned earlier, you can enter your questions for our panelists at any time in the question box on the right side of your screen, and I will collect these and read the questions during the Q&A portion after the presentations. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Laura Haynes.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I'm going to give an overview of how aging impacts the immune response to vaccines today in my talk. Next slide. So your immune response to a vaccine consists of 2 arms. There's the innate immune arm and the adaptive immune arm. And the innate immune response happens very quickly after you see a vaccination or an infection. And it's not going to be specific for the invading pathogen, but it's going to be the very first line of defense. And the cells that are involved in this are cells such as your macrophages, your dendritic cells, your natural killer cells, and your granulocytes. And then you have the adaptive immune response, which is going to be much slower. It's going to take on the order of 10 to 14 days to develop, and it's going to be very specific for each pathogen. So the adaptive immune response to something like a SARS-CoV-2 infection is going to be very different from the adaptive response to a Mycobacterium tuberculosis infection. So the cells that are involved in this are your B cells, which generate antibodies, and then your T cells, which are the CD4 helper T cells and the CD8 killer T cells. Next slide, please. So there's two kinds of protective adaptive immune responses that are induced by vaccination. So the first is the response of helper T cells, B cells, and antibodies. So as the name implies, these T cells help B cells to generate high affinity antibodies that will bind to something like an invading virus and neutralize it and remove it from the system. The second are killer T cells. So if any of these viruses escape the antibodies and actually end up infecting cells in your body, the killer T cells will recognize this and they will kill the virus-infected cells. This will then prevent the production of new virus particles. Next slide. So with aging, you have weakened immune defenses. So when you're young, you have very strong immunity that protects you from many kinds of infection. And if you do become infected, there's not a large impact on your health and ability to function. So you may get sick for a little bit with an infection, but your recovery is fairly quick, and you oftentimes, more often, go back to your pre-infection status when the infection is over. But with age, your immune defenses are weakened by multiple factors that occur with biological aging, and this results in a more intense infection, more symptoms, and sometimes even death, extended recovery time, so it takes much longer to go back to the way you were prior to infection, and oftentimes people don't recover and don't end up going back to how they were prior to infection and have permanent disabilities following a severe infection. Next slide. So what happens to immunity with aging? So the simple answer is it's dampened greatly. And on the top left-hand side, you see the innate immune response with aging, and you have diminished function of dendritic cells, neutrophils, NK cells, but at the same time, you have increased inflammatory cytokine production by cells such as macrophages. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see what we refer to as inflammaging, the inflammation that occurs with aging. And this is due to enhanced inflammatory cytokine production with age. And this can be the result of multiple things that happen with aging, including chronic infections, changes in mitochondrial function, changes in your microbiota, and increased cellular senescence. All of these things contribute to increased inflammatory cytokine production with aging, and this is thought to be the basis for many age-related diseases. And then with regards to the adaptive immune response, we see again that it's mostly diminished with age. So you have decreased B cell function, decreased antibody production, decreased T cell function, but also you have increased presence of things such as exhausted T cells that don't function the way that they should. Next slide. So with regards to vaccines, there's broadly two categories of vaccines with regards to the immune responses that they induce. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we have inactivated vaccines and subunit vaccines. So these are vaccines such as your yearly influenza vaccine, polio vaccine, your hepatitis vaccine, your shingles vaccine. These all contain either the whole inactivated virus or pieces of the virus, and they induce helper T cells, B cells, and antibodies as their mechanism of protection. On the right-hand side, you have the other category, which includes live attenuated vaccines and the new messenger RNA vaccines. So, these are things such as your measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, your chickenpox vaccine, your smallpox vaccine, if you got one, and then, of course, your COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. So in addition to inducing helper T cells, B cells, and antibodies, these vaccines also induce killer T cells. So they bring in another protective mechanism. Next slide. So the goal of vaccination is to induce long-term protective immunological memory. So when you get a vaccine and you're a healthy young adult, you get a very vigorous primary response to a vaccine, and then this wanes and it goes down to almost undetectable levels. And these cells will remain in your body for months to years until you encounter the pathogen that they're specific for. And when you get exposed to this pathogen, you have a very robust memory response. This response can be your both helper and killer T cells and antibody. And these are going to really be there to stop the invading pathogen. And oftentimes this response is so effective that you don't even realize that you've been infected. Next slide. So when you're young, you get a very vigorous response, great lymphocyte response, great antibody response. This is going to lead to protective memory that will last for a very long time. So when you get vaccines as a young adult, the protection can last until you're very old in many cases. If you're an older adult and you get a new vaccine, it's going to induce much less of a robust primary response with regards to helper T cells and antibodies, and it's going to probably lead to a less protective memory that doesn't last as long as it would in a younger adult. Next slide. And that's shown here in the red. So when you compare the response in a young adult in the blue to that in an older adult in the red, you see that the primary response to a vaccine isn't as vigorous. And then the memory response that you generate when you're exposed to the pathogen also is not as robust. You don't, so you're not going to have the same sort of immune protection you do as a young adult. Next slide. But there is hope. So for example, our influenza vaccines that we currently have don't work so well in older adults. They work much better in younger people. These vaccines only induce helper T cells and antibodies. But work that's ongoing now has shown that if you target killer T cells in older adults, this could be a way to improve flu vaccines. And one way that this can be done is to use an mRNA-based influenza vaccine. And that's going to, in addition to inducing helper T cells and antibodies, it's going to also now bring in killer T cells. And I just did a quick Google search here and found 3 articles describing the development of mRNA vaccines for influenza. So hopefully they'll be on the market in the not too distant future. Next slide. So finally, this is my last slide. We have our weakened immune defenses with aging, but we can really strengthen those immune defenses in older adults if we have effective vaccines. And this will build back up our fortress of protection in our older adults. And in this case, when we have these strengthened immune responses with these new vaccines, it will reduce the level of illness in older adults. It will reduce the incidence of symptoms, the incidence of hospitalizations. It will also shorten the recovery time in older adults and allow them to return to their pre-infection state more readily than without these more protective vaccines. And really, that's what we want to do, is increase the post-infection health span of older adults. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Good day, everybody. It's great to be here at the part of the webinar, and thanks for joining us on the webinar as well. So building on Dr. Haynes' presentation, I want to tell you about how these advances in vaccine science are actually improving vaccine effectiveness in older adults, especially with regards to COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide. This figure shows the vaccine ecosystem in the United States as a framework for understanding what it takes to develop vaccines, and particularly COVID vaccines. And right away, you can see it's a complicated system, isn't it? It starts with disease surveillance and public health priorities up in the upper left there. And could there be any higher priority than COVID? And then it's followed by the research to create the vaccine, do the preclinical and clinical testing and development in the column on the left. And if we're lucky enough to have an effective and safe vaccine, which we do with COVID vaccines, to be authorized or licensed by the...
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. It sounds like your audio isn't that clear. Would you be able to switch to the phone call by any chance?
Which number? Does it sound better now?
Nope, it doesn't. But that's okay. I can give you the phone number. Or if you select the phone call in your control panel, the audio information will be displayed.
All right, how's this? Any better?
So much better. Thank you so much. We'll just start over. Thank you.
Fantastic. Let's go to slide 2 there. So this is the vaccine ecosystem in the United States as a framework for understanding what it takes to develop these COVID vaccines. And right away, you can see it's a complicated system. It starts off with disease surveillance and public health priorities in the upper left there. And like I was saying, could there be any higher priority than COVID? And it's followed by research to create the vaccine, doing the preclinical and clinical testing and development. If you're lucky enough to have an effective and safe vaccine, which we do with COVID vaccines, then it needs to be authorized by the FDA, and then clinical guidance and recommendations by the CDC through the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. With those steps in hand, we manufacture, distribute it, start vaccinating individuals. Now that vaccination step is has a few components to it. One is it's influenced by attitudes towards vaccination, and that's a problem in this country. There's a fair number of amount of vaccine hesitancy. Then who's going to pay for it? And post-licensure, we do adverse event monitoring, and also vaccine uptake and surveillance, and real-world effectiveness studies. But hopefully at the end of all that, we've got high vaccination rates, and we actually do reduce the illness, which in this case is COVID-19. Next slide. So I'm going to focus now on these advances and building again on Dr. Haynes' presentation. So this is the childhood immunization schedule from the CDC. And look there, there's a huge number of vaccines. There's actually about 18 of them. The yellow is recommended for everyone in that age group. They all work really well. They have high vaccine efficacy. And they're almost all inactivated or live attenuated vaccines. Technologies have been used for over 100 years. Next slide. So here's the adult immunization schedule by age group. Look at the over age 65 column on the right there. What do you notice? Far fewer vaccines, right? In fact, there are only 4 for routine vaccination. And except for the recombinant zoster vaccine or Shingrix, the performance of these vaccines is suboptimal, like influenza that Dr. Haynes mentioned, and certainly much less than childhood vaccines. And these are using older platforms except for Shingrix. And in fact, why would vaccine platforms that work in children necessarily work in older adults? So clearly we need better platforms. Next slide. So it's quite exciting that we've really entered a new era in vaccine science. There have been two major advances in vaccine science that allowed us to engineer better platforms. One advance is the development of novel adjuvants. An adjuvant is a substance that enhances the immune response to foreign substances, that foreign invader, if you will, which we also call an antigen. And the antigens in the vaccines I'm talking about here are basically proteins. The potential benefits of using these novel adjuvants are shown in this slide here. But the one we're really interested in is that blue oval there, right? And the one for vaccines in older adults to overcome declining immunity with aging or immune senescence. Next slide. So another advance is the use of recombinant nucleic acid technology. This technology allows us to select and utilize genes that make the proteins or antigens that the immune system recognizes to destroy the virus. So there are three I want to point out here. One is recombinant proteins or subunits. Here we use the technology to insert a gene into a cell system that secretes that antigen, that protein, in a highly purified state. The next is viral vectors. Here we're using a harmless virus. It's generally an adenovirus. It's been rendered harmless and contains the genes that make the antigen. Think of it as a stealth carrier, if you will, to deliver the gene when injected into the body, and then it makes the protein or antigen. And then finally, there are the mRNA vaccines, like Dr. Haynes mentioned. The messenger RNA makes the antigen of interest, and it's injected in the body, usually associated with a carrier molecule, a lipid particle of some kind. All right, next slide. So what is that protein in these vaccines for COVID-19 vaccines? Well, it's the famous spike protein that you see on this picture here, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. This is the protein that elicits the immune response that stops the virus from being so harmful. All right, next slide. So how does this work in the platforms that we have? So this shows the various platforms we have now targeting SARS-CoV-2, the type of platform and the products. So the Novavax vaccine uses the spike protein plus a novel adjuvant that's formulated in something called a lipid nanoparticle. The AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines use an adenovirus that has the spike protein gene in it to deliver the spike protein, like I mentioned. And then the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines use the messenger RNA to make the spike protein. All right, next slide. So the question is, do these new platforms work in older adults, right? That's what we want to know. Well, this slide shows the manufacturers, the platform, the vaccine efficacy in percent for all ages. This is the percent reduction in symptomatic COVID-19, and then vaccine efficacy in people over the age of 65. And right away, if you scan down the column for all ages, you see very high vaccine efficacy, right? But guess what? The same is true for vaccine efficacy in people over the age of 65. 95% in Pfizer BioNTech, a little over 86% in Moderna, 76.5% for Janssen. The AstraZeneca vaccine, 85%. We don't yet have the Novavax results. That's coming, but I anticipate it'll also be high because this is a similar platform technology that we use for Shingrix. And for Shingrix, the vaccine efficacy in people over the age of 70 is 90%. So this is really great evidence that these new platforms are indeed effective in older adults and are a step in overcoming immune senescence. So let's go on to the last slide that I have here. So where are we with vaccine clinical development here? So first off, for the Moderna and Pfizer messenger RNA vaccines, the FDA authorized them and the ACIP voted to use them in December, as you may know. But what we're anticipating is full licensure in spring. They'll probably be applying for this pretty soon. Remember, right now, we're on a emergency use authorization. That means there is no FDA-approved vaccine and licensed fully for preventing COVID-19. It's an emergency use. So this licensure step is going to be very important. The Janssen vaccine received its emergency use authorization at the end of February in the ACIP vote in March 1. And they'll probably be applying for licensure sometime in the summer. The AstraZeneca vaccine has completed its trials in the United States, and we anticipate the EUA submission to the FDA sometime this month, and Novavax will occur afterwards. Now, I want to point out, this says vaccine clinical development, but there's a new wrinkle. This is actually adult vaccine development. Pfizer has completed adolescent trials with very high efficacy, and they plan on an emergency use authorization submission this month. Moderna is well along the way with their adolescent studies, and they've all started pediatric studies as well, which I think is a welcome thing coming up. So with that, I'll conclude my comments, and I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Barzilai.
It looks like you're muted. You just need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry for that. I thanked Laura and Ken for how they prepared now for my presentation. And my presentation is more about the misconception. And let me tell you the misconception. We all know that there's a biology of aging because we know who's old and who's young. But what we don't know is that this biology is actually quite flexible. Okay, and we can target aging that is really driving the diseases. We can target it. We can delay aging. We can stop aging and reverse aging in certain examples and prevent the age-related diseases. And this is how we have to frame this conversation, because it's almost not about COVID anymore. That happened. It's about the next infection as well. So in the next slide, I just want to make a point. It shows the relationship between death from variety of age-related diseases and age. And it's maybe not surprising to you that as we go up with age, we also have more diseases. But look, it's a log scale, okay? If you look at the blue light color of heart disease, it goes from 5 to 100,000 to 5,000. There's a 1,000 risk factor for when you're older getting a heart disease, which is not like cholesterol, which is a 3 or 5-fold factor. The same for diabetes. Obesity is an 8-fold factor, but aging is a hundreds factor, and the same is for cancer and everything. And this gives you kind of the flavor that you have to stop aging, because what happens if you stop one disease, you're just going to get the other. If you walk to the emergency room with a heart attack and you get a stent or a bypass, well, in 2 years, you're going to get cancer or Alzheimer or diabetes because we never treated the aging part. And this is underlined really very dramatic in the case of COVID in the next slide. And what you see here in the next slide, the next slide.
Sorry, 1 second. I know that my slides are stuck. 1 second.
What you'll see in the next slide is the cases of death of COVID from all over the world. And you'll see there China and Italy and the United States and the European Union. And the story there is exactly the same. The risk of dying from COVID when you're over the age of 80 is 200-fold of the risk when you're in your 20s. Or in the United States, 70% of the deaths are in the age over the age of 80. So this virus that has no eyes can actually pick up on the elderly. And we're claiming this is not necessary. And I need the next slide in order to maybe make this point. But let me already start and tell you something. Look, there's there's a chronological age and biological age, right? We all know that. We all know that from us, from our friends, from our parents. We age at different rates, and this is something that's very important for us and the scientists to discover really those biomarkers and make sure that we know how to distinguish between chronological and biological age. But as far as this vaccine is concerned, and I'm very optimistic because everything of what Ken showed, I think those vaccines are going to be amazing. But I want to say just one thing. At age 65, half of the people have less than 2 age-related diseases, and half of the people have more than 2 age-related diseases. And those vaccines, although went over the age of 65, they picked people who on average had less than 1 disease. So those are the people who are slowing aging. How effective is this vaccine in people whose aging is not slow? We don't know yet. I hope it's okay. I'm sure that it's better than the flu, but we have to remember this part too. Guys, shall I be optimistic about the proposal? I can talk.
I'm so sorry, my screen is stuck. We're working on getting your slides back up.
Okay, so what I'm going to show on the next slide, and I might ask to skip slides later. What I'm going to show you is, so you're asking, hey, what are you talking about? Laura said there are geroprotectors. How can we intervene with aging? Well, and when I say we are geroscientists, we agree on about 8 hallmarks of aging. Those are knobs that we can turn on. In order to be a hallmark of aging, you have to show that this thing is impaired with aging, and that if you correct it in animals, they live healthier and they live longer. And this was really important for our field because once we agreed to that, it's not only us, it's also biotechs that started looking at those hallmarks in order to start developing drugs and combination of drugs that can be really targeting aging effectively. Not only that, those hallmarks of aging are interconnected. In other words, you can target one of them and it's going to affect several of the others. You don't have to target everyone in order to start making progress in aging. And so those hallmarks are really important. And I would say that what we geroscientists showed, is that we can extend health span and lifespan. And look, we're about health span. A lifespan is maybe a side effect if we're doing more health span. We have extended health span in variety of animal models by variety of ways. And not only that, there are drugs that are now in human use that can be adapted in order to help with this part that Laura in their fortress showed geroprotectors. How do we really prevent the severe hospitalization and death from those people? My slides have disappeared totally. Are you assuring me that I'm coming back? Okay, this is the slide that I talked about China having 200-fold more deaths in 8 years old than in 20 years old. Let's go over the next slide. And those are the hallmarks of aging. What I want to point out is that one of them is immune dysfunction, and Laura talked about that. And the other is the inflammation, or as she said, the inflammaging, that are both explaining why the elderly are getting the virus and dying from the virus. So we need to increase the immunity and decrease the inflammation, but that's not enough. We need this body to be stronger in order to sustain a severe disease once it gets the disease and when it's going on. And again, it's important against COVID-19, but it's important for next virus and for every other disease. And by the way, the interaction between you see the lines here where I said you don't have to target all of them to make an advance in health span. Next slide. And this is the slide where I was going to show that when you're 65, half of the people have less than 2 disease and half have more. The darker colors are accumulation of up to 7 diseases, and you see that it increases with age. And the next slide is to make 2 points. I just said that health span and lifespan have been extended in animals, and there are drugs to do it. I want to talk about very briefly about 2 examples. Maybe I'll answer more in the questions if it needs to. But first of all, the best thing you could do if you're older or in any age is to exercise and to move. Okay, this is something that has impact on almost all those hallmarks of aging. The second thing, and what this slide shows you, is what happens if we take brothers and divide them to group that eats whatever they want and the other are caloric restricted. And you see those who eat whatever they want, they're 100% alive, and then they're dead. All of them are dead by 120 weeks. But when you take and caloric restrict them, you see that they are getting less, are dying. They're always reaching their full lifespan capacity, and then they are dying. In fact, what we're doing here is not only decreasing food, but we also provide the food in the morning, so they are eating everything because they are hungry, and then they are fasting. And it's actually the fasting that is very important for longevity. And a lot of us, including myself, are doing this 16 8-hour fasting. We stop eating after dinner until 16 hours later. No cheating, and it improves some of the aging, the biology of aging. The second example, if this combination of rapamycin and metformin, where you give to animals, against in red are the ones who are in placebo and they start dying, and those that are in this combination therapy live 24% longer. Just to give you an idea of what we have in the field and how we determine what happens. Next slide. There is a drug that's called Metformin, and I know I'm short on time. Or guys, tell me, how much did I waste, and how much time do I have?
You're fine. You can continue.
Metformin is a generic and cheap drug that was used in the 1950s to treat flu and malaria, and then it was discovered that people were taking it, and if they're diabetic, it lowers glucose, and it became an anti-diabetic drug. But it's really a drug that, as is shown here are the hallmarks of aging on the right. It actually targets all the hallmarks of aging. In other words, it makes the cell, the organ, the body young enough so that everything is improving. This is the combination of the dots in the hallmarks. And when we give it to animals, it extends their health span and lifespan. Next slide. It's been in use for 70 years in human, and we know that it prevents diabetes in non-diabetic. It prevents heart disease in people with diabetes compared to other drugs. There are hundreds of studies all showing that people on metformin have about 30% less cancers. In clinical studies and association studies, it delays cognitive decline and Alzheimer's. And really, quite incredibly, people on metformin have lower mortality than people not on metformin. This is a huge study in the UK with almost 200,000 people. 78,000 people of them are on metformin, and 78,000 people treated by the same doctors in the same pharmacies. And the people with metformin have diabetes, and they're more sick, and they're more obese, and yet they have 17% less mortality. So we have a lot of evidence that metformin is actually target the aging part. And to show you, next slide, this is one of 9 studies out there that shows in this case that people with diabetes who had COVID, if they were older, so we're looking at odds ratio. If the odds ratio is 1, then it didn't matter. If it's towards 10, that's 10-fold mortality, and this is 0, so it's going by, this is 2/3 less mortality. So people who are older have more mortality when they have COVID. Race didn't matter. Gender, yeah, male have more, obese have more. Hypertension didn't matter in this study. But people on metformin had 67% less mortality than people without metformin. So we're not talking about hydroxyurea effect. We're talking about a huge decrease in mortality. Imagine that all the elderly would be on metformin and we would take down mortality by 67%. It would have a major effect on everything. The next study is kind of the same, but it shows, next slide, it shows mortality. Okay, so here everybody is alive. People without metformin died. A lot of them died. People on metformin had 50% less mortality, more than 50% less mortality than people who are not on metformin. Again, just one of many evidence that if we would have thought about it, we could have put elderly on metformin, improve their biology of aging, and prevent hospitalization and mortality. What we're doing now with, and this is led by AFAR, is in the next slide. We are using metformin as a tool, and we started a study that's called Targeting Aging with Metformin that will prove the concept that a composite of age-related disease is going to be prevented by metformin. But it's really mainly designed, and I'm leading this study mainly to convince the FDA that aging can be prevented. And when you prevent aging, you don't prevent one disease, you prevent a lot of disease, and you improve the health span and the quality of life of people. The next slide, and is the last slide, is just to tell you that the future is even much more hopeful. And I'll leave you with this thought. What you see here is a blastocyte. Let's say you take an egg of a 50-year-old woman and a sperm of a 70-year-old man, and you create, you fertilize the egg, and we can measure the egg of the sperm and the egg. And what happens is the new baby that is formed doesn't contain the memory of his parents. We all start at 0 in this example. So the way we're thinking about it is that we can use some tools that we know, and maybe every so often we'll start erase our aging, and so that we can start being young to begin with, rather than stop aging at where we started getting sick. And so with this thought and with this promise, I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much. If everyone could turn their cameras back on. We have lots of questions. So let's start with a question about side effects. When older people, some of them have adverse reactions to some vaccines, some to others. What is that about? What does that mean when some people have side effects and others don't?
I'd be happy to take the lead on that. It's actually a sign that they're building immunity. The side effects, the local reactions, the injection site pain, the fatigue, the headache and myalgia systemically are usually mediated by the types of chemicals that are building the immune reaction.
And I will just add, look, I was sick with COVID very mildly. I was much sicker after the vaccination. but my mother-in-law is 88 years old and have 6 other diseases, didn't have any of the reactions to the first and second dose. And the question for me is, was she really immunized? She was vaccinated, but was she really immunized? So I think there are those 2 things that you have to worry about maybe.
If an older person has already had COVID-19 and developed the antibodies, why is a vaccine necessary while the antibodies are present?
Yeah, the duration of protection following natural infection is not completely known, and it's not complete either. So it's good to boost the immune protection even further with the vaccine.
We have a lot of questions about the J&J vaccine. And if you can speak a little bit about the data behind that one.
Well, the data shows that it's an effective vaccine. I mean, I was showing the vaccine efficacy there on the slide there. The numbers aren't quite as high as the mRNA vaccines like Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech, but it definitely reduced the incidence of moderate to severe COVID. You know, that's an important point. Is I was showing symptomatic COVID, but if we have a vaccine that actually keeps people out of the hospital, prevents dying, and prevents functional decline, that's tremendous. And all these vaccines are very highly effective at that. Similarly, or I should say an advantage, of course, of the Janssen vaccine is just one shot. And that's nice to be able to use something that's pretty stable at refrigerator temperatures for one shot.
The higher efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines in older people is surprising to one of our participants, given the age-related declines in immunity that you've described. What are some of the likely immunological reasons for this?
I can take that question. Again, I think it goes back to what I said in my talk, is that we've shown, and this is work from our groups here in Connecticut and also colleagues in Canada, is that the mRNA vaccines specifically bring in a CD8 killer T cells that seem to be much more functional in older adults when compared to the other arm, the CD4 helper T cells and B cells in older adults. So I think bringing in this other more functional part of the immune response to the vaccine milieu now is allowing the vaccine to induce really great protection in older adults.
Thank you. Is there any research being done on the impact of the vaccines on the long haulers?
I think there is, and yeah, I think it's, you know, these things are just beginning, and this is something that may take a number of months to years to really figure out. I know we have a couple of these studies going on here at UConn, and you guys probably have them at your institutions also.
Yeah, Laura, let me add on to that. That the NIH has initiated a huge effort to understand this better. They're trying to replace the term long hauler with something called postacute sequelae of COVID, or PASC, P-A-S-C, that will have multiple institutions around the United States studying this intensely. Yeah, the question was about the vaccine's effect on that. I guess there probably are some people who have been vaccinated and may develop COVID that has long-term, but we haven't seen many of those people yet. But we certainly need to know more about this syndrome. It's incredibly important.
Do you feel confident that there are no long-term side effects to the mRNA vaccines?
Yes.
I can start there too. Yeah, I'll say yes too. Anything more you want to say, Laura?
No, that's it.
Okay. Another one of my hats is I work with the CDC on something called a Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Office and Project. One of the investigators for long-term safety and short-term safety of these vaccines in older adults. And I've done a number of case consultations, and we've got a huge amount of data now, several months after looking through different databases, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and there's several others. There's one that's very geriatric specific called Genesis that's run through Brown that the NIA is funding. And so far, we haven't found any long-term side effects of mRNA vaccines.
Can I ask Laura and Ken another question? Based on Laura, what you showed about the types of vaccine, why people are so afraid that they'll have to be vaccinated again? I mean, couldn't it be like rubella or measles and have lifetime effects?
You know, I think it could. We just don't know. And I think people are comparing it more to influenza vaccines, which really isn't a fair comparison because the SARS-CoV-2 virus doesn't change the way influenza virus changes every year. And so, but I think they see development of the variants as something that may require boosters. But I think from what we've seen, most of the variants that are circulating now are neutralized by antibodies that are generated by the vaccines that we have on the market, unless somebody's seen something different.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm trying to have some optimism, that's all.
So speaking of optimism, everyone wants to know about Metformin. So at what age do you believe people should begin taking Metformin? And related to that, are there side effects? Can it be prescribed to an older, frail person with multiple comorbidities?
So we are doing a study where we are repurposing, right? We are repurposing a known drug, and we're doing it with a clinical study that includes people over the age of 65. So the question about when is the best time is very appropriate. In fact, there's some evidence that if young people take metformin and they exercise, it doesn't have that much of a good effect. So the context of the age and the person are very important, and we're trying to stay away from it. It's similar to other drugs that I didn't talk about, but for example, there's a drug that targets what is known commonly as the zombie cells. It's really all cells that are secreting things that causes eventually some trouble. They're called senescent cells. And you guys don't have much senescent cells, so it's not the right age to do that, right? It's more for people who are 70 or 80 years old. So each one of those geroprotectors will have a time. And I kind of gave this example of the baby, right? And maybe we start at 20, kind of erasing aging, and this is something that we'll have to figure out. I'll tell you that clinical studies have usually started after age 50 on what we know about metformin, and it started in people who had some risk factors, such as obesity or diabetes. So I wouldn't get out of this range. If some young people are asking you that, don't take metformin.
Well, we're almost at the end of our hour. So I want to close by inviting all of you to share some final words of wisdom, just a key takeaway. And Dr. Haynes, we'll start with you.
I would say my key takeaway would be get vaccinated against COVID-19. The vaccines are safe, they're effective, they will protect you. Even if they don't protect you from getting ill, they will protect you from getting extremely ill and going to the hospital, which is really what we don't want. And as I showed in my graphs, it will have a less impact on your health. If you do get infected, you will heal faster. You will be able to return to your pre-infection state so that you have no long-term effects following infection.
Dr. Schmader.
Yeah, I'm going to first off echo definitely what Laura said, but also this is an incredibly exciting time scientifically in two ways. One is the advances in vaccine science that I talked about have been phenomenal just over the last few years. I've been working with vaccines in older adults since the early 1990s, and what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years has been mind-blowing. And to emphasize my point, we developed vaccines in a year for COVID-19. It's incredible. And then on top of that, the geroscience that Dr. Barzilai is talking about is really groundbreaking as well.
Dr. Barzilai.
I want to again, I'm totally supporting the comments before. I would have said them if I would start, but I'll tell you one thing. We understand the association of geroprotectors to this virus and maybe to the next virus. But look, people who are surviving cancers are aging rapidly because we give them chemotherapy and radiation, and they need help of geroprotectors. People who have HIV get age-related disease 10 years younger. I would say people who are debilitated or in wheelchair needs help because they cannot move and they eat more. If we want to go to Mars, okay, and people are seriously looking at that, we cannot go there before we solve aging, because we'll get cancer or heart disease on the way back. We'll never make it back. So there's a need to start stopping this aging stuff, which we can start doing it right now, and it will take care of a lot of problems for a lot of people.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters, Dr. Laura Haynes, Dr. Kenneth Schmader, and Dr. Nir Barzilai for being with us today. I also want to thank the American Federation for Aging Research for their partnership on today's webinar, as well as Generations United on their partnership for our vaccine series, and of course the John A. Hartford Foundation for their support. We will be making today's presentation available to anyone who wishes to view it later, including the slides and the audio, so watch for an email to be sent within a few days. We hope you will join us for the next webinar in the series, Rides That Save Lives, which will focus on approaches to providing rural older people with access to the vaccine. You can learn more at our website, giaging.org. And finally, thank you all for participating in today's webinar. We apologize for our technical difficulties, and we'd appreciate if you complete the brief evaluation of the program that you will soon see on your screen. You will also receive the survey in an email tomorrow. Thank you and be well.
Thank you.